Welcome back to Smarter in 10, the podcast that brings big ideas to curious minds, one tight episode at a time. I'm David Peterson from the DMP Strategy Group, and today we're tackling one of the most controversial economic theories in the modern era, one that's been called both revolutionary and, well, reckless. It's called Modern Monetary Theory, or MMT for short, and at its core is a pretty provocative question. What if governments that print their own money can never run out of it? Let's get smarter. Modern monetary theory flips much of traditional economics on its head. While conventional thinking says governments must collect taxes or borrow money to fund spending, MMT says something far more radical. A country that issues its own currency can always pay its bills, because it can always print more money. Sound crazy? Maybe. But let's look at the logic behind it. MMT starts with a basic observation. Governments like the United States, the United Kingdom, or Japan don't use someone else's currency. They issue their own. The dollar, the pound, the yen. Unlike households or businesses, they can't go broke in their own currency. So why do we treat government budgets like household budgets? MMT says we shouldn't. Here's a common metaphor in politics. If families have to balance their budgets, so should the government. MMT economists say this is fundamentally flawed. Imagine you had a printing press in your basement that let you create legal US dollars anytime you needed. Would you ever run out of money? No. Would you have to borrow or save before spending? Not really. Now obviously this printing press metaphor isn't perfect, because there are consequences to printing too much money. We'll get to that. But the MMT perspective says that a sovereign currency issuer is not financially constrained like a person or a business. The real limit isn't money, it's resources. MMT doesn't claim that governments can spend infinitely with no consequences. What it does say is this: the true constraint on spending is inflation, not solvency. If there's slack in the economy, like unemployed people or unused factories, the government can and should spend to boost demand. Once the economy hits capacity, that is, once all resources are fully used, then spending can cause inflation. So MMT's key message is, spend when there's room, stop when there isn't. Here's where it gets even more interesting and, honestly, controversial. If governments can print money to fund spending, what's the point of taxes? According to MMT, taxes aren't needed to fund spending. Instead, they serve four other purposes. Control inflation. Taxes take money out of the economy, reducing demand, create demand for the currency. You need dollars to pay taxes, so people accept dollars. Redistribute wealth. Progressive taxes shift purchasing power. Shape behavior. Think carbon taxes or sin taxes. In the MMT view, spending comes first, taxation comes second. The government injects money by spending, and removes it by taxing. MMT has inspired bold policy proposals, especially from progressive economists and politicians. If governments aren't financially constrained, why not guarantee a federal job for anyone who wants one? Or invest massively in infrastructure and green energy? Maybe even fund universal healthcare and education? After all, if the resources are available, labor, technology, materials, the government can create demand for them without borrowing from anyone. This really turns the usual budget debate upside down. It's no longer, can we afford it? But instead, do we have the real-world capacity to do it without sparking inflation? You might be thinking, this sounds academic. Has anyone actually tried this? While no country explicitly follows MMT, elements of the theory appeared during the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments around the world spent trillions, much of it funded by central banks buying up government debt. In the United States, for example, Congress passed massive stimulus bills. The Federal Reserve bought bonds, keeping interest rates low. The Treasury sent checks directly to Americans without paying for them through taxes. This looked a lot like MMT in practice. The government spent big to keep the economy afloat, and borrowing costs remained low. Mainstream economists, across the political spectrum, have raised concerns about MMT. The biggest fear is that printing money to fund spending could spark runaway inflation, or even hyperinflation. Think Zimbabwe in the 2000s or Venezuela more recently. MMT says inflation is the only true limit, but predicting exactly when inflation will occur, and how to stop it, is incredibly tricky. Even if MMT is technically correct, critics ask, can we really trust politicians to stop spending when inflation appears? Once spending programs are in place, they're hard to unwind. Some fear that printing money undermines confidence in the currency, potentially leading to capital flight, rising interest rates, or currency devaluation. Even MMT economists acknowledge that money creation must match productive capacity. If the government spends without limits, you get too much money chasing too few goods. And that's a recipe for rising prices. It's easy to paint MMT as extreme, but there's growing agreement on some points. Governments with their own currency are not like households. Austerity during recessions can worsen economic pain. Low inflation and low interest rates may justify more public investment. In fact, even central banks have moved closer to MMT territory. The Federal Reserve now focuses on maximum employment and is less afraid of moderate inflation. And prominent economists, like Paul Krugman, have said that while they disagree with MMT, the debate has pushed the profession to rethink stale assumptions. Modern monetary theory is a bold rethinking of public finance. It says the real constraint on government spending isn't money, it's resources and inflation. Taxes don't fund spending, they manage demand. Deficits aren't inherently bad, they're just the difference between what the government injects and what it takes out. Whether you see MMT as a dangerous fantasy or a necessary evolution, one thing's clear: it's changing how we think about debt, budgets, and economic potential. So, next time someone says, "We can't afford it," ask, can we really not afford it, or are we just choosing not to try? Thanks for joining me today on Smarter in 10. If this episode challenged your thinking or sparked a deeper interest in economic theory, share it with someone you debate about money. Until next time, I'm David Peterson from the DMP Strategy Group. Stay sharp.